Suffering seems to be an inevitable fact of life. At one point or another, we've all suffered in our own ways, and we've certainly asked the question of how we can transform the suffering into joy. In this video, I'll go over just that. This is everything I learned about how to transform suffering into peace, joy, and liberation from the heart of the Buddha's teachings. Before I get into it, I would like to have a little disclaimer and say that I am leaving out a lot of information from this book. There's simply too much for me to cover in one short video, and I just want to condense the main takeaways that I got from the book that have helped me in my day-to-day life. So to get right into it, let's say right now you're suffering. You might be angry, sad, whatever emotion you might feel. The first step is to recognize that you are suffering. Once you've recognized that you're suffering, you aren't trying to deceive yourself anymore. I think most of us, when we are suffering, if we're angry, sad, etc., we always try to escape it. We do things to get our mind off of it. But the first step that Buddhism teaches is to recognize that we are suffering so we can treat the problem at its source. Think of how a doctor may treat some kind of physical pain. He'll look at your limb or part of your body and he'll poke and prod around and ask you where the source of the pain is coming from. It's the same idea here, but instead of physical pain, we're looking for emotional pain. So let's say right now you're angry. The first step is to recognize your anger. Then the second step would be to try to find the source of that. It is much easier said than done, but I hope today I can help give you some tips on how you might be able to do that yourself. Something important to realize is that a lot of our suffering comes from wanting. If we want to be happy, we're perceiving ourselves as suffering. Or let's say you've lost an object that's important to you, like if I were to lose this notebook. I might perceive myself as suffering now, but I need to realize that I've attached my emotions to the notebook. If I lose the notebook, then I begin to feel bad. The point I'm trying to get across with this analogy is that we need to become aware of what we've attached our emotions to. If we've attached our emotions to things outside of our control and we lose those things, then we begin to suffer. But we need to realize that actually letting go of that object is freeing ourselves. Imagine if someone were to insult you. You've emotionally tied your response to what they've just said to you, and now let's say they make you angry. Now, whatever they say to you, they can affect your emotions. It's best to realize as many of these emotional ties as we have so we can free ourselves of them, because a lot of our suffering comes from these ties. In the book, our emotions are often compared to as a seed. If we're happy, we are watering the seeds in our consciousness that make us happy. If we're sad, we're watering the seeds in our consciousness that make us sad. So, Buddhism argues that if we want to feel happy, we should water the good seeds and not water the bad ones. Become aware of what thoughts enter your mind. If they're negative or irritating thoughts, embrace them. Don't shove them away or push them away, you'll only make it worse. We need to embrace the negative thoughts and water the happy seeds in our consciousness if we want to feel better over a longer period of time. That's another important distinction that Buddhism makes. We will never be able to get rid of these negative emotions in us, but if we can become aware that they exist and they exist in our consciousness, then we can do things in our day-to-day lives that make us happier. In other words, we can water the happy seeds of our consciousness. It also says that by recognizing the emotion itself, it loses a lot of its strength. If you'd like some kind of real-world scientific example of this, you could look no further than neural pathways. We form habits by doing things over and over again, and our emotional responses to certain things are just habits that we've conditioned ourselves to respond to things by. And to further elaborate on this, Buddhism has the idea of a store consciousness and a mind consciousness. You could think of the store consciousness as our habits, our impulses that we've trained ourselves over the years to do, and our mind consciousness as our actual observing of thoughts. So anytime a thought comes into our mind, that's our mind consciousness, but the thought actually reaching out into the mind comes from the store consciousness. Again, going with the idea of embracing our negative emotions, It's never about pushing them back down, it's always about embracing them and nurturing them into a better emotion. That's one of the key principles of Buddhism. We're not trying to ignore our suffering, we are actively embracing it and turning it into joy, happiness, and liberation. We should never look at our emotions with disgust, anger, or fear. We should actively embrace these emotions and try to learn about them and where they've come from. That is what will actually cause us to be happy. And by recognizing the thought itself, a lot of our emotional anguish will immediately vanish. I kind of briefly touched on this in my last video, which I'll leave up here, but our perception of ourselves is our perception of the world. And that's why we need to treat ourselves kindly. If we pollute the water of the world, we're polluting the water that we drink. And if we treat ourselves with hatred, disgust, or fear, we will treat others the same. So it is important, anytime these negative emotions come up, to embrace them and accept them, and learn how we can change them to feel better. A little quote I'd like to read from the book goes as follows. "The path that does not run away from but embraces our suffering is the path that will lead us to liberation." Another major teaching and practice of Buddhism are the three Dharma seals. They are impermanence, non-self, and nirvana. Impermanence is the idea that nothing is permanent. We may share time on earth together right now, but one day you and I both will have to face death. The same is true for our emotions. Our emotions are not permanent, but neither is our suffering. What makes us suffer is wanting things to be permanent when they are not. The same can even be said for joy and happiness. We want joy and happiness to last forever, but that's not the case. If we're suffering right now, that's evidence enough that joy and happiness are not permanent. But once we realize this, that nothing is permanent, we are free of that idea. We're no longer suffering anymore. Non-self is the concept that nothing has a separate existence. Everything that exists right now must codepend on each other to exist. A flower cannot exist without sunlight, soil, and water, among other things. Humans can't exist without nutrients, water, and oxygen, among other things as well. Our existence relies on many things outside of ourselves, and we need to treat these things with as much respect as ourselves. Let's say a family member of yours is happy, and that causes you to be happy. Your happiness is dependent on theirs. So if we want to be happy and healthy as a community, we need to treat these things that we rely on with as much respect as we treat ourselves. Lastly, nirvana is the concept of no concepts. It is a bit paradoxical because there is no birth and no death with the concept of nirvana, but nirvana itself isn't really a concept. Allow me to explain a little more. I'll give you a little example that the book provides, as well as some of my own insight onto this, as much as I can offer. I feel like I don't fully understand this, but I do understand it enough to give you somewhat of an idea. Everything in existence is a wave. Everything we see, everything we hear, everything we touch, it's all waves that are interpreted by our brain that create our existence. We see a beginning and an end to the wave. There's a birth and a death. Now, we'd all like to believe that there is a beginning and an end, a birth and a death of every wave. But in Buddhism, they say the wave never began and it never ended. It was just part of the sea that it comes from. As you know, energy cannot be created or destroyed. When we die, we are in essence just returning to the sea. But the truth is, we are already there. This concept of no birth and no death can be a little difficult to grasp. It took me a little bit to have the understanding that I have of it now, which is a pretty elementary and basic understanding of the concept. But that's why I advise you to look into this yourself if you'd like to learn more about it. I can only do so well explaining this to you, but I do have one more example that I think might help understand this. Siddhartha, or as we know him, the Buddha, may be dead now, but his teachings are very well still here. A quote from the book says, "The flower cannot be limited to its brief manifestation. Take this tree behind me. If it just up and died and fell on the ground and decomposed, the soil and the earth would take all of its nutrients and mushrooms would begin to spring from the dead tree. So yes, the tree might be dead, but its energy has just taken a new form. The same thing happens with us. So physically, we might not be here when we die. In 100 years, I don't know where my body will be buried or if I'll be cremated or whatever, but these videos will still be up. This is still a solidification of my being in history. The same follows with the Buddha's teachings. He died around 2600 years ago, but we still discuss his ideas today. So while Siddhartha or the Buddha may not be physically alive, we can still find him in our hearts. And this is a core message of Buddhism. Anyone can be a Buddha. It's all within us. The core message of Buddhism is that our suffering can be transformed into peace, joy, and liberation. This is what Siddhartha taught, and this is what Buddhism is all about. This is why all of us are capable of being Buddhas. We need to realize that our suffering can be turned into joy, peace, and liberation. And I'll leave you guys with one last thought. Remember that a lot of our perceptions that cause negative emotions comes from a lack of insight. So if we seek to understand the emotions that we feel, we can gain insight into why we feel a certain way and treat the problem at its source. That'll be it for this video. I hope this was helpful. If there's anything that I missed, please leave a comment below. This was a lot of information for me to take in within the span of a week, and naturally, I missed a lot of it. I just wanted to get across the core messages and the things that I learned because this was very eye-opening to read. At some point in the future, I plan on revisiting Buddhism and making a series on it, but for now I'm just going to focus on Carl Jung. And to the commenter who left this comment on my happiness video, I hope this helps, and I will see you guys probably next week. Thank you for watching, like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.